Okay friends, now it's time to get started on our emergency brake shoes. To do that, you're going to want to safely raise and support the rear of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground. After that, remove all 5 of your 19mm lug nuts and then the wheel. With the wheel off of there, we have a nice clear view of the brakes. To start disassembling this, we're going to come right over to the caliper. Inside of the caliper, there's a piston that expands and applies pressure to the rotor by the brake pads. We want to go ahead and push back that piston so we can get it out of the way. I'm going to come right in between this area, in between the caliper and the bracket itself. While I pry this, it's going to slowly start pushing in that piston. We only need it to go in a little bit, and then we can continue once it's all apart. Now from the back side of the caliper, you're going to find 2 14mm headed bolts. Let's go ahead and remove the pair. For the first one, I always just loosen it up and leave it in a couple threads, then fully remove the second. As you remove each of the bolts, give them a quick inspection. Assuming they look good, set them aside. Now we can carefully take the caliper out of the area. Once you have it off of there, you want to give it a quick inspection, especially along the area where the piston is. If you see any fluid in this area, that means it's brake fluid and your caliper is no good. Let's go ahead and push this piston back as far as we can. Typically you do that with a caliper compression tool. Now once we have this fully compressed, we're just going to double check to make sure we still don't have any fluid. At this point, we know the caliper should be good, so we can set it aside. Let's remove the pads using a pry bar. I always give them a quick inspection just to see how they're wearing. If they're wearing at an angle, typically that means you're having an issue with one of the slider pins. With all that out of the way, we can continue on to removing the caliper bracket from the area. To do that, you're going to find 2 more 14mm headed bolts. Go ahead and remove the pair. Give both of your bolts a quick inspection. Assuming they look good, set them aside. Now we can also remove the bracket. Now that we have that out of the way, the next thing we want to do is go ahead and remove the rotor from this area. Now if you were to look closely at it, you can see that on our rotor it has 2 dimples, one over here and one right over there. Commonly, you're going to find 2 Phillips head screws inside of these holes. You just want to go ahead and take them out. Ours are missing. Also, there should be a rubber plug in this area right here. Once again, ours is missing. Go ahead and remove all 3. Now to remove this rotor, typically I like to use one of my lug nuts. I'm just going to start it on one of these studs. It only needs to be a few good threads. It's kind of a safety nut. Now let's continue on with our hammer, and we want to carefully bonk just on this area of the rotor, being very careful not to damage either of the studs that are near it, or even the braking surface of the rotor itself. Once it's broken free, remove your lug nut, then remove the rotor. Now with that rotor out of the way, we have a nice clear view of each of our emergency brake shoes. There's one on the rear, and there's one over on the forward side as well. Looking at it, you're going to find a whole bunch of hardware that holds it to the backing plate. We're going to start with one of the springs along the bottom. To start removing this, I'm going to come down from the bottom right here. I'm just going to use some long nose pliers and gently get in between the shoe and the hub and try to pry it down a little bit. Now once I have it down, it exposes this area right here where you can see the mounting spring. Let's go ahead and grab that out of the other side as well. As you continue removing your hardware, you need to give it a good inspection. If it seems as though anything's rotted or weak or damaged in any way, you need to go ahead and replace the hardware with the shoes. This one looks fine, so I can continue. Now we can come from down in here. I'm going to grab onto this area. This is considered your adjuster. Sometimes you just have to try to spread the shoes or move them a little bit. Now that we have that out of there, we're going to give it a quick inspection. You want to make sure that it doesn't seem like it's seized up or frozen in any way. One side should come completely out and the other side should be able to unscrew. If it doesn't unscrew, bring it over to the bench and make sure it functions properly, otherwise it needs to be replaced. Now let's make our way up to the anchor pin area. Looking at this, you can see the very tip of the pin. The other end of this pin is all the way on the back side. Now what we need to do with this pin, essentially, is to try to press in the tab that holds it in position. Once we have it pressed in, we're going to grab onto that pin with some long nose pliers and twist it so it lines up with the corresponding slot. Once it lines up, you can carefully release this. We can take this clip out of here. Now I always just come from the back side. I'm going to remove that pin as well so you can have a close look at it. There we are. As you can tell, it has an odd bend to it. But mostly what you want to pay attention to is actually just the rot and everything. Make sure it looks like it's still solid and it's going to be able to be reusable. Now I'm just going to hold the shoe up against the backing plate. After that, I'll continue with my long nose pliers. I'm going to come right up to this top spring. I'll grab right onto the ear of that spring and remove it from its mounting point. Go ahead and start pulling this away a little bit. We can remove this spring. Okay, so there's that spring. Now let's just use this pick. We're going to carefully get underneath the spring and pull it off. Go ahead and grab onto that shoe. We'll slowly start pulling it away so we can grab our spring. Now we can pull this down. As you turn it around, you're going to find a horseshoe clip. We need to separate this clip, pull it off of there, so we can remove this from the shoe. Now I went ahead and I put this on a little table to hold it still for me while I continue removing this horseshoe. To do that, we want to separate the two ears. Typically you do that with a small screwdriver. Once you start getting it separated, you can use some pliers to continue. And I want to grab on in between those two ears and the nub that comes up. Once it starts coming off, go ahead and just pry it right off. Now once you have it off of there, you're going to want to pay attention to these two pieces. This right here is just a washer. It needs to be in good condition, but this is the main area that we need to talk about. You're going to have to reuse this, and it needs to be able to hold this on. You want to make sure it's still in good working order. If it isn't, it needs to be replaced. Now we can separate the emergency brake lever from the shoe. Give this area a quick inspection. Set your shoe aside. To start removing this shoe, we're going to come right up on top for that mounting spring. Use my long nose pliers, carefully grab onto it. I'm going to pry up against the edge of the shoe as I start removing it. We can move this. Now we can start with our anchor pin. Now that we have that out of there, we can give this a little wiggle. We can remove our clip. Grab onto that shoe, remove it from the area. Let's get that pin out of here. Now up along the top, in between those shoes, there was a metal bridge. We're going to grab that out of there and give it an inspection as well. Now with the shoes out of the way, the next thing that we want to pay attention to is the backing plate. You want to make sure it's still secure and it doesn't seem like it's weak or flimsy in any way. Aside from that, we also want to make sure that there isn't any rot buildup on it, so of course we're going to try to scrape some of this off. but the areas that you need to mainly pay attention to are the areas that raise up a little bit on the backing plate. Now, if you look hard enough at this one, you're going to be able to see that it has several of them. 3 along the back side of the hub here, and then you'll have 3 more along the forward aspect that look exactly the same. With that said, let's continue with a wire brush. We're just going to go ahead and try to clean this down as best as possible. Now that I have it sanded, you can clearly see all the mounting points. Now I'll do the same on the other side of the backing plate. With that sanded down, I'm just going to come right in here and make sure there isn't any more debris. Now that we've done that, let's go ahead and sand down this area as well, essentially just the areas that are going to hit directly against the shoe. Now let's clean up the inside of this mounting hole. I'm just going to use some rolled up sandpaper. To clean the adjuster, you want to go ahead and make sure you take it completely apart and inspect it along the way. If you're going to be reusing the hardware, you need to make sure you clean up any of the rust or rot on it and give it a thorough inspection. Now we'll sand everything down and then re-lubricate it. Now we're going to want to lubricate this with some high temperature brake grease. When I do this, I want to go ahead and put it into each side of this adjuster. Now, since I lubricated the threaded end, let's take the threaded side of this. We'll put it right in there and bottom it out. Let's lubricate the other side. The point of using the grease is to help keep moisture and debris from in the area and prevent it from seizing up. Okay. Now we can set this aside. Once you've finished with that, continue on with the high temperature grease. We're going to go along each of the areas that we sanded down on the backing plate. Let's also lubricate up along the sides of this top pin. That's essentially where the shoe is going to be hitting. And then we'll also lubricate this along the entire area that we sanded and especially inside of the pivot hole. Now over on the bench, we're going to talk about our original rear shoe. Looking at it, you can see that it has this little pin on here. That's the pin that goes to that lever that we cleaned up. We want to go ahead and drive this right out of here. Sometimes you can just push it. Other times you need to give it a loving tap with a hammer. Now once that's out of there, you want to give it a quick inspection. Go ahead and sand it down so it's free and clear of any debris, and then we'll insert it into one of our brand new shoes. We're going to take one of our shoes, make sure it's in the same position as the original, put this through from the same side. Now we can get back over to the vehicle. Let's go ahead and grab onto this. We're going to swing it into position. Slide it right on over that shoe. Now we can see we have our pin protruding. Let's go ahead and put on that washer and then our locking clip. Once you have it fully in position, go ahead and squeeze it tight. Give it a wiggle to make sure it's completely secure and there's no way that this can fall apart while you're driving down the road. Let's take one of our pins. We're going to put it through the backing plate. Before we go ahead and put the shoe all the way up on here, I wanted to show you the curve of the pin itself. Now looking at the curve, you can tell that I have it bent out and away from the wheel bearing. That needs to go around this lever right here along the back side. Let's go ahead and put this up in here. Now we're going to slide the pin through its corresponding hole. Now with the pin in the upright position like that, we're going to go ahead and put our clip on there. Once we have the clip on, we're going to press this in and then we're going to turn that so it's facing sideways. Make sure it's completely locked in. Now we can take our bridge in this position, so this is facing towards the rear of the vehicle. Just go ahead and slide it right in there into the groove of the shoe. Now let's take the spring that looks like this. It has a little Scooby-Doo that comes up at an angle. We're going to take this end and put it into this hole on the emergency brake shoe, the circular hole right down here. Once we have it on there, we're going to stretch it into the hole that goes onto the metal bridge. Now we can start putting in this spring. Looking at it, you can tell that one of the edges that comes out sits a little bit off kilter, kind of protrudes out to the side. The other side, if you were to look at it head on, you can tell that it comes right through the center area of it. It's important to notice. Now for this spring, we're going to take it with the one that protrudes out to the side, and we're going to put this directly into the shoe. Come right through here, grab it with my pliers. Now we can grab the other end and put it up and over this hook. Now we can start putting on the other emergency brake shoe. Now we can take this, put it into position, and we'll take this hook and put it up and over the top. Now let's grab the pin for that shoe. We're going to slide it right on through that backing plate. Line the shoe up with the hole, slide the pin through there. Let's set that so it's facing up and down. Release our clip. Make sure it's completely secured. Let's take that adjuster, we're going to slide it into position. Looking at it, you can see that it has grooves on either end. Those grooves need to fit directly over each shoe. So we're going to have it in this position. Slide it right in there. This one right in here. Continuing on with the spring, go ahead and put it into each of its corresponding holes. Double check everything to make sure it's completely secured. The next thing that we're going to do is move along to cleaning up our hub area. This is the area that the rotor is going to be sitting directly against, so it needs to be clean and free of any debris. Once you have the main surface cleaned up, don't forget about the area in between the lug studs and the center of the hub. It's just as important to make sure you clean each of these 5 areas. Let's use some parts cleaner on the area. Once you feel as though it's sufficiently cleaned, go ahead and coat the area with some copper never sees. Double check to make sure you don't have any on your emergency brake shoes. Before you go ahead and put on your rotor, it's important to make sure you clean the mating surface on the back as well. Other areas to think about is where the emergency brake shoes are going to ride. You want to make sure that this is clean and free of any debris as well. Once you're sure that that looks good, you want to continue on to this outer aspect. You can see that there's a ridge that comes all the way around. This is going to be the area that's almost directly up against the backing plate. You want to make sure there isn't any raised areas from rot or anything the like. Okay, this looks good enough. I'm going to be replacing the rotor anyways. Let's go ahead and clean all 3 braking surfaces on our rotor. I'm going to spray this outer aspect. And wipe that down. Now we can turn it around, and then we'll also clean the inner braking surface. Now we can get ready to put on our rotor. Before we do, I wanted you to take a quick look at the hub. Looking at it, you're going to find two areas that have threaded holes. On the brake rotor, we have those dimples. Essentially, that's where there should be bolts that hold this to the hub behind it. So we want to make sure we have everything lined up. A quick note about the brake rotors, you're going to notice in the set, one faces one direction and the other faces the opposite. Looking at this, you can tell the exact direction that it's supposed to rotate. Now that we have it on here, the next thing that you would want to do, if you have them, you would put in each of these two screws and make sure they're tight. After that, we're going to pay attention to this hole right here. This is the adjustment port. All I want to do is turn this so it's facing down in the downward position right here. Then we'll take a nice small screwdriver, we can come right in here, and we're going to grab onto that cog. The cog is how you make your adjustments. So if you go one direction, once you're up against it and start pulling down, it's going to adjust it up or adjust the shoes out. And if you go in the other direction, it's going to start bringing them in. So if it feels like you can grab this and you can spin it all willy-nilly and it doesn't have any resistance, typically you want to adjust it out a little bit until you can just barely hear the shoes touching the rotor. If you try to turn it and it doesn't want to turn, well, that's not a good thing. What you're going to have to do is go ahead and line this up and de-adjust it so you have just barely a tiny bit of drag coming from this area. Let's remove the rotor so you can see what I'm talking about. Once you feel as though you have it fully adjusted, go ahead and reinsert your rubber plug. Once again, ours is missing. Let's get that caliper bracket installed. Slide it right into position. We'll start in both of our 14mm headed bolts. Once they're each started, we can snug them up. Then we'll torque each of them to 41 foot-pounds. Now it's going to be time to install our brake pads. You want to make sure that you have one of the pads that has the wear indicator on it. Now that pad is going to be the inboard pad. We want that tab to be facing down. Go ahead and slide that right in. Now we'll take one of the pads that does not have the wear indicator on it. Slide that into position on the opposite side of the rotor. And now we can go ahead and put the caliper up and onto the caliper bracket. Let's grab our two caliper slider bolts, start each of these in. Once they're each started, you can bottom them out, and then we'll torque each of these to 16 foot-pounds. We're getting to the point that we're going to put the wheel on, but before we do, just give everything a double check. You want to make sure you torqued everything for the caliper, and of course, put back in the bolts if you had removed any, and the rubber plug. Our bolts and plug was missing. Let's get the wheel back up on here. Now we can start on all 5 of our lug nuts. We'll tighten them up, get the wheel back on the ground, and then torque each of them to 80 foot-pounds. Torqued. Okay friends, we got the car back together. What's left to do now? Now you're going to want to do the exact same thing on the other side of the vehicle. After that, go ahead and make sure you pump up that brake pedal till it's nice and firm. Take it for a road test. Also, you want to make sure that you test that emergency brake, make sure it holds the vehicle, and it isn't making noise while you're driving. Thanks for watching.